The annual budget for public consultation. Councillors, we had an extensive discussion around the three items on finance and performance. So I'm going to ask Chair of the Finance and Performance Committee to move the recommendations, and maybe Councillor Simpson as Vice Chair, you might want to second that for the annual budget for public consultation. The items you have in front of you that we agreed yesterday, we had the debate yesterday, so I'm presuming we can just move straight to put these recommendations.
Yes.
Okay, all those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. To the contrary, no. Carried. Item number 12, we come to contributions policy, and if I can invite to the table, please, Andrew Duncan and Ross Tucker. We've also workshopped this item quite recently. In fact, we've had 3 workshops on it, the most recent being the 6th of December. But this is the occasion in which we formally adopt the recommendations and the amendments that have been made to the development contributions. So I will ask you, Duncan, when you've repaired your microphone, just to speak to the extent you need to the recommendations, so that everybody is clear on how the development contribution policy has evolved since the original put up. This is after consultation. When we consult, we listen, and when we listen, we sometimes change, and in this case, we have changed. But Andrew, if you'd like to just walk us through those changes.
Good morning. This report recommends that you adopt Development Contributions Policy 2019, come into force on the 1st of January, to reflect the investment you've committed to in capital expenditure to facilitate growth in the 10-year budget. Policy provides a fair allocation of the cost of some of that capital expenditure to developers, but also provides a fair allocation of those costs between different development types. We've just recently completed an extensive consultation. You've heard directly from a number of developers, and we got substantial feedback through that process, building off the most comprehensive set of materials we've provided to support consultation on DCs. So the policy we're proposing that you adopt today reflects the value of those feedback and consultation processes the Council undertakes to support its decision making. And we're suggesting some amendments in response to that feedback. A couple of key ones are in relation to the capital expenditure schedules. Included in that schedule was approximately $300 million program of spending that we'd committed to in the future to facilitate residential development around the city. And we're proposing, rather than including that now in the DC policy, because it's a very broad program, we'll include it either in the DC policy in the future on a project-by-project basis, and therefore fund it in the local areas where those investments are being made on a project basis, rather than more broadly across larger regional areas. And we'll recover those costs over time still. We'd also propose to make some adjustments to the unit of demand factors for transport that would have increased the share paid by retail and commercial developers. Got a lot of good feedback on that, and a number of issues were raised that we'd like to explore further, so that when you are considering this issue again at some point in the future, you've got all that information in front of you when you're making those decisions. So we're recommending at this point that you retain the unit of demand factors for transport that are in the 2015 policy, and both of those changes are included in the draft that we've got in front of you today. Now, as you know, from our workshops, we've worked very closely with our legal team and with our external legal advisors to make sure that the policy we're putting in front of you meets all our legal obligations under the Local Government Act and minimises the legal risks that we could face in this space. Since we've finalised the report on Monday, we've been continuing to consider those matters, and we're proposing one other minor change to our recommendations. This slightly reduces the share of reserves investment and community facilities investments that we would recover from retirement villages. So we're knocking the charge down, the demand factor from them down from 0.2 to 0.1. And that's reflected in the additional materials that have been tabled for you at the moment. So that's a minor change to that reference in the report, but also to Schedules 2, where there's one change reflecting the movement of 0.2 to 0.1, and also some minor changes to the various prices for those services set out in Schedule 3, which a copy of has also been circulated to you. The report's also recommending the adoption of all the other changes that were proposed for consultation, with some minor amendments. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. As I said, we have workshopped this 3 times, but it is quite complex, so there may be some clarifications of the changes needed. So I'm going to take questions first. Councillor Newman, yours was a comment or a question?
Both actually.
Okay. Well, can we ask the? We'll separate the two if we can ask the question
I won't
first.
ask the question.
Okay. Fine. Councillor Casey.
Yeah, I have a question. Andrew, could you just explain your response to the compelling arguments presented to us by the community housing sector, in particular the Housing New Zealand Foundation, which I heard, and I'm a bit disappointed in your response, but perhaps you could explain why you haven't taken the action they asked for.
There's a couple of key areas in that space. One was around seeking discounts effectively for social housing. The second was to seek some more. At the moment we charge one standard, got a standard price, one household equivalent unit for properties between 100 and 249 square metres. Then we charge 20% more if you're over 250, and we charge 20% less, or 0.8 if you're under 100. They'd asked us to introduce another smaller size banding. I can't quite remember the exact one, maybe up to 130, down to 75, something in that space. So on those 2 factors, our advice was DCs are a cost recovery mechanism, and that if we are wishing to support social housing, then to do so more directly with grants, as you've done for the city mission development, is the most appropriate way to do it. Because if we lowered the charge for this group, we can't increase the charge for others, and we would have to do it from rates anyway. Therefore, it's better to do it more directly. In regard to the housing band sizings, we don't have any new statistical information. We will be getting some in March, and we can look at that again at that time. We've also indicated in the paper that officers will look at on a case-by-case basis at non-government social housing provider developments where they meet sort of similar criteria, that we would consider looking at different options for the payment timing, which then might give some support in that space on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you very much. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a question about funding areas, in particular 105, where it talks about the contributions policy, 7 additional funding areas for transport, and it talks about, and I'm talking about the Northwest, and it says mainly the transport infrastructure is mainly road sealing for the benefit of the rural areas northwest and south, but we don't, I'm wondering, how do we address in the contributions policy where 25% of the growth will occur where the public transport is woefully inadequate? How do the contributions support public transport rather than just road sealing?
So the contributions policy follows the council's decision making on its capital investments. So all the contributions policy is doing is seeking to recover part of that cost from growth.
So it's a response to us talking about road sealing rather than public transport then?
But there
I
will be,
understand.
yeah, and that'll depend on the particular areas where the
Okay.
investment's been focused and how that's dealing with growth. Presumably in the future, as the areas develop, there will be more public transport investment, which then can be recovered from DCs by additional growth in the area.
Councillor Walker.
Sure, just got a question around the reserves, and I'm just looking at the schedule here. So if I apply this to the North Shore, is the reserve acquisition for the North Shore a situation where the 4569, which is under North Shore, would be in addition to, let's say, the North Greenfield? So I add the two together, or is it substitutive? That is, the North Greenfield would not include the North Shore.
No, they're added together. So when you pay your development contribution, you pay a local and a sub-regional and a regional component, reflecting the level that the investments in the particular. So the projects invested in the northwest Greenfield area may or may not add to the North Shore area, depending on whether the two areas overlap. But certainly the North Greenfields, hang on, reserve acquisition. I'll just ask Bobby whether those two areas overlap or not. I mean, it's probable. So which ones of these overlap, Bobby?
Okay, the North Greenfield is north of Albany. It's in the Greenfield area. So there may be a couple of properties or something that overlap, but all the North Shore data is, the majority of that's historic expenditure, whereas the North Greenfield is all for planned expenditure.
So that
But they are mostly different areas.
So that would be the urban.
So
that would most of the North Shore would overlap with the urban
Yes.
reserve acquisition line,
Yes.
so
sub-regional.
I add the two together though. That's
So 4569 plus 2058 for most of the North Shore.
okay. And the reason why we've got a relatively high local reserve acquisition on the North Shore is because we've got a number of locations identified for acquisition.
It's mostly historic expenditure. So there's a very
I
significant
don't
amount
have
of
a problem
reserves.
with that.
Yeah.
That's great.
Okay, thank you.
I had one other question.
Oh, one other question, Councillor Walker.
And that just goes to the reduction in, I think, reserves for retirement units. And I haven't read the background material on that, but one of the observations I make is you've got increasing numbers of people moving into these retirement units, and that includes increasing numbers of younger people, and certainly circumstances where I observe they are visiting parks on bus trips, and that includes regional parks and others. So yes, there may be some issues around mobility, but I put a question mark around actually dropping the contribution and what data supports that.
This is an area where there are a number of different perspectives on the use of and value, whether you use it or not, that you might get from parks, whether you live in a retirement village or student accommodation or in a standard dwelling. So we are going to do further investigation on that, so we're able to further refine how we share the cost between the different kinds of residential development, and that's a work program that we are kicking off at the moment.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I would commend that, and that's against the background where there are increasing numbers of people in these retirement complexes. I hope that I don't number amongst that in the near future.
It happens eventually,
Never knows
Councillor.
what's going to happen.
Okay, thank you. Before we move on to comments, I'll maybe ask the Deputy Mayor to move this recommendation. the recommendations and seconded by,
Oh, no, I had questions still.
oh,
Sorry.
okay, seconded by, I'll get a seconder first, Councillor Darby. You had a question, Councillor?
Yeah, through you. Chair, first of all, thank you for the extensive work you did, and the people that contacted me said they got a really good hearing and information back and forth with your team and yourself, so thank you for that. I did have some serious concerns around the transport and the retail, and so it's good to hear we're continuing that work to make sure those figures are correct. I do have some issue, and like Councillor Walker says, around the retirement, have we got a legal view of that, or what is, to reduce it that much, obviously means someone else, it increases somewhere else. And I would say there is a lot, because this is retirement villages that are purchased by people, not pensioner housing or is, yeah.
So it is retirement villages units, which could include pensioner housing
Okay.
in certain circumstances.
But yeah, so it's not generally social housing though. This is
Could increase.
No, it's not social housing, although Housing New Zealand does develop some complexes that may have this form. We will work with, and they'd asked for us to amend the way in which we defined retirement units in the policy. We felt that it was appropriate to stay with our current definition, but did identify in our advice that we will work with them on a case-by-case basis, and where their developments would meet similar criteria in terms of the nature of demand they'll place on our services, that we would treat them in the same way, but we'll look at that on a case-by-case basis to ensure that what they're proposing to do does indeed match up with our requirements.
yeah, because I just worry about the assumptions when I feel they aren't true. If you look at our figures of library usage and community facility usage and reserves, that there are many older people using those facilities and getting to them. So yeah, I just want to know how we're measuring the demand for that, and we're reducing that quite considerably.
So if I can just say, we think these are valid concerns. These are good questions, and I think we need to do some more work on those. The legal view is pretty clear that to impose a charge, you have to have your policy backed up by good evidence. So what we're proposing to do is put these charges in place now, and then do the work. So we've got the evidence to look at these things with the right level of detail, the right level of evidence behind us, and then come back to it next year and revisit these prices.
I mean, I can think of one in my area of 400, which are very close to all our reserves, so that obviously people are using those reserves surrounding that area. I just wonder how we're going to measure that going forward.
It's a valid concern, but I think what we know is that if we don't have the evidence before you change the charges, then you run into legal difficulties, and that's been the experience. So we're doing it in the evidence first, and then changes afterwards order, and that makes sense. Councillor Darby, question.
I'll come to the comment.
Oh, comment. Okay, we'll go to comments straight away. Councillor Newman, first up.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I want to say that I think that the contributions policy will require a higher quantum of contribution than we have at the moment. So I support the intent of what we're trying to do, but of course it does have to be evidence-based, and it is not just a matter of causation. Causation principle has to be offset by the benefits received principle, and that needs to be addressed. I guess the one thing, Your Worship, concurrent to this, I understand that a government bill, the Local Government Community Wellbeing Amendment Bill, is being put through at the moment. I would assume that when that bill is passed, because that restores community wellbeing principle, and one of the consequences of that is it does restore council's power to collect development contributions for any public amenity needed as a consequence of development, and this is designed to assist with the provision of facilities such as sports grounds, swimming pools and libraries. So I would expect that there will be further changes in the future, probably to reflect the application of that bill when that bill becomes law, because I do think that notwithstanding any changes that we do adopt in this policy, we will need a further change to the policy, because there is no doubt, and I slate this back to residential growth and development, that has a consequential impact in the form of greater demand for public amenities in the community. It's not just about council going on a shopping spree wanting to get a whole lot of things that we can't currently get because we don't have the funding. The demand is there, and if there is a facility that is required and there is a means to be able to require contributions to support that, that's what I would expect we will do, and that will almost certainly impact in terms of the residential household unit equivalent DC that will be charged. So I thank the officers for heeding the submissions and the expressions of concern by submitters, particularly from the retail shopping centre community. I look forward to getting some more advice about that. Look, and the other thing I would say, Your Worship, is that this policy will impose some of the highest contributions levied against developers in my ward. And I support that. I strongly support that, because that is the cost of the stormwater infrastructure. And so I defend that. I think that's appropriate. In fact, if anything, I think that the numbers are actually a wee bit light. So thank you to the officers for what is a very complex piece of work. I look forward to seeing it progress. There will need to be further changes, and I expect when that government bill is passed that we'll need to quickly revert to a discussion about further consequential changes to the policy to address the ability to collect contributions for public amenities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Darby.
Thank you. Look, I also support the principle the exacerbator pays for the benefits received, and that has not been the case, and that's why we are reviewing this. And I stress again that the general ratepayer, the general property ratepayer right across Auckland has been subsidising greenfields edge development to a massive extent. They just haven't known about it, and many probably still don't know about the extent that they are subsidising development in the outskirts of Auckland. So I entirely support this direction. We've got work to do. Probably the area I just do want to dwell on, though, is we're looking at lower demand factors for retirement villages. And retirement villages themselves are changing. They are businesses within villages, and there are now, in some of the master plan communities, there are commercial cafes that are open to the public. So I'm hoping that our teams start to dig into the retirement village model. I'm also mindful that retirement villages do generate considerable transport impacts. I'm aware of a retirement village that, after 12 months of opening, expanded its car parking. Now, I'm not sure whether it did that with any sort of consent or how that was factored into paying further development contributions retrospectively. I'm aware of retirement villages where units are offered 2 car parks, where that car parking is oversubscribed. Yet the industry lobbies us extremely hard with a very convincing argument why the demand factor should be lowered. I guess I'm inviting the staff to look again at retirement villages. And like Councillor Walker, I'm very aware of the programs probably through family experiences where our parents are finding that their way to such villages, or maybe other family friends, where our parks are relied upon for the bus trip. They use it differently, but they're going to that park destination because it is a wonderful environment that is paid for by others, and we are giving them relief and letting them off the hook, but they are in fact enjoying that amenity. I guess I'm also interested in some categories going forward that have much greater demand on the transport budget of the city, and that is the big box retail, and we are looking at them hard, and we will continue to look at them hard. And I commend the staff for being brave enough and staying the course, because, at least for this politician speaking, that is the political directive, that we have to bring equity to this, because it's out of kilter at the moment. So please stay on course there. The other area probably is some industries like maybe petrol stations, which generate incredible transport demands. And I would be interested to know in a future workshop just how we equitably collect development contributions from those sorts of examples, and I'm just raising that as one example. But even with this review completed, subject to the further engagement, I think won't be long before we're back to even further refine our development contribution policy. And I thank the staff for the very robust work, evidence-based work that you're bringing to this task. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure. Like Councillor Darby, I'd like to commend the staff. We're moving in the right direction. The amount of contributions is going up. But for me, especially across reserves, it's still really inadequate. If I look at the reserve acquisition, regional, and I'm assuming that applies to regional parks, $153 a unit, frankly, is not going to cut it, even in terms of the amount that's attributable to the extra population that we're talking here. Because if we look at where we've traditionally located regional parks, and much of that has been around the coastline and so on, we know that coastal property and properties generally are increasing. So if I crunch the numbers on that, and I won't go into it here, I just find that it's not enough. And then if I look at acquisitions for sub-regional and local, and if I apply that to an example, let's say out west or some part of Auckland, the amount of contribution all up might be, I don't know, let's say it's $9,000, say it's $8,000, as a percentage of a property which might be selling for 700,000, 800,000, maybe you're looking at 1 or 1.5%. And I know councillors have heard this before, but that compares to 7.5% under the Reserves Act, which is what put in place most of the reserves that we see around us. And again, when I crunch the numbers and I apply what we're looking at in terms of area, we are not going to have the space in the future for the reserves that Aucklanders need, and all the things that go on those reserves that enable the sorts of clubs and societies that we see in this part of Auckland in existence. But we're not going to see the space for those areas and those clubs and societies in any of the new parts of Auckland, because the space is just not going to be there. So we're going to have two Aucklands. We're going to have one Auckland, which is the historical part of Auckland, where there are lots and lots of facilities and great things for people to do, youth, older people, youth centres, lots of things for retired people, lots of little clubs and societies that are in club rooms, most of which are on our council reserves. But go out to the new areas, you won't find any of that into the future. And that's a real distortion that I think we need to do some more work on. And I would encourage the officers to do that. So that's my comment, Mr.
Thank
Mayor.
you. Thank you, Councillor. Last comment from Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd also acknowledge the work, because this is tricky stuff. And I think some of the lessons we've learnt, and I've been talking with the team about it, is we need to get the principles around exacerbators and beneficiaries. We need to get that right. And we need to get the data to back up our position so that we can prove it in a court if need be. And it needs to be modern data and best up-to-date modelling. When we did the hearings process here, the formal hearings process, what really got my attention was the fact that the developers unanimously agreed that there had to be a contribution. They weren't trying to skive out. They were saying, we understand the need for this, we just want it to be fair and equitable and evidence-based. And I'd like to acknowledge them for that, because they see their role in this business of building the city, and they take it responsibly. So, Mr. Chair, Mr. Mayor, thank you for letting me chair those hearings. It was worthwhile, it was interesting, and we gave a good hearing to all those who were present. And I think the results that we have before us today, by and large, reflect the desires that the developers have put forward, plus the community as well. And we'll be able to test that through the public consultation process next year. Yep. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor, and thank you for chairing that session, for hearing the submissions from the developers. So the motions are there in front of us. It's been moved and they've been moved and seconded. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried.